Hey Pete, thanks for being on the show today.
G'day Brent, lovely to have you over and doing this podcast with you this morning.
Yeah, and as you can hear for the listeners, we are doing this podcast in person. It's a beautiful day in Ballarat and I'm at Pete's house, and I've just seen his new extraction line, which is really exciting. Do you want to tell us about that, Pete?
Yeah mate, so we've been doing it tough this year with a lot of honey and our existing extraction line. You wouldn't really call it a line, but it's a very short line, and we've come to the point in our business where we've been thinking about this for a while, and we just really need to upscale, and by upscaling really cut down the time of extraction by 500% or more. And that is certainly our plan, and this is what the new equipment will enable us to do.
So what have you bought?
I bought a licensed premium 40 frame extraction line, which we believe will deliver for us. It runs a wax press rather than a reducer. That'll just pretty much maintain our integrity with our raw honey mindset and sort of ideology that we run with here at home by producing raw honey, real raw honey, and minimal heating and extracting, etc., etc.
Yeah, fantastic. What's really interesting is there's sort of a few different setups for extraction. You know, there's the small setup, which is the 2 or 4 frame. Then you've got maybe 16 frames, something like that, and then you go up to extraction line. What do you think is a good sort of amount of hives that supports each level? You know, for people, you know, who are keeping bees and they're not sure where they should be at in terms of their extraction, what do you think's best?
That's a really good question, Brent. And a lot of people might think that, hey, let's just get a 2 frame extractor to start off with 1 hive. And this is why I somewhat have a slightly different view on that in my experience, because I've had 1 hive, I've had 5, I've had 15, I've had 20, and I've had 50, I've had 100. So in reality, what I would recommend if somebody's actually getting into bees, I did start with a 2 framer, but that didn't last very long at all, because the cheap 2 framer that I bought was a Chinese thing, and it was a tangential, which means the frames were facing the actual walls and didn't have much support, and the frames would blow out. So,
is that one of the little white ones?
Yeah, little very
white
narrow.
Ones,
white ones, or any one of those.
How hard are they to use?
I would not recommend that. Do yourself a favour.
Yeah.
You want to enjoy your beekeeping.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I did have one there, but I sold it very quickly to a friend of mine.
Yeah.
Who then
for
quickly
$1.
very cheaply, half price, for $1. And I've actually bought a League 4 framer.
Yeah, I've got one of those. They're really good. Yeah.
They're very good. So much bigger box, 4 frames. Yeah, it's nice. But if I was starting again and I knew that I was going to probably end up with 5 or 6 hives or 8 hives, I would actually look at the second-hand market and see if I could find a 6 or 8 framer. Or even 16. Let's say you got 4 hives. Surely you would get 16 frames from 4 hives, and it'll only take you 1 spin to do it. So, and what I'm saying is, like, a 4 framer for you now, a manual one's around $800-900. Second hand, you can pick a 16 or a 12 for $1,500. You know, I've seen them online. So I put my 16 one automatic radial. It cost me $2,700. Right? It paid itself back very quickly. So I would suggest that I wouldn't go any smaller than a 4. 3s, yeah, they're okay. I haven't had experience with those, but go for a 4. Go for a 4.
If someone's a sideliner and they're doing, honey farming, at what point do you think you have to move up from a 16 frame extractor to an extraction line, which is what you've got now?
30, 40 hives. 50 hives would kind of be the beginning, but that would also depending on your business plan and on your vision, on your goals. What do you want to do? Do you want to actually expand to 100, 150 hives? Or are you happy running 30 or 40 hives? If you're just happy running that number of hives, justifying an extraction plant can be somewhat difficult, but there will be, and there are second-hand plants out there for 20, 25 grand. So if you've got a lazy 25 grand, 30 grand, well, invest, but for that money, you're not going to get something new, and you might have to refurbish, put money in, or whatever else. So that's not something that I would recommend at that stage. You can get yourself a really, a 24 framer. Get yourself a 24 framer, and with maybe an uncapper. There's a couple of there's at least one business here in Australia that sells uncappers that are made in China, mind you. I'm not in favour of Chinese stuff, but yeah, you can do with that, and the money that you spend isn't that big. But the first thing I would do is really look at your vision, look at your plan. What do you want to achieve? Where do you want to go? What level do you want to stay? And that'll determine as to what kind of equipment you really want to invest in, because you don't want to overcapitalise.
Yeah, sure. So what level of hives do you think you get to a point where you think, okay, it should definitely be above a 16 frame extractor,
Oh, I would say 50 or 60 hives if you're getting regular honey, depending what you're doing. If you're bringing in honey, you definitely would need some sort of a line. And they're, they're JB lines that are 24 framers, semi-horizontals and that kind of stuff. And run one of those. With an uncapper, and that'll be good. There's a lot of options out there on the marketplace in terms of size of plant that you might need to actually deal with your honey. Because if you don't, the big thing is you'll get stuck in your honey shed with an uncapping fork.
Yeah, and that's happened a bunch of times to you in the last year. A couple of times I've called you and you've been up really late doing honey, just like, I've still got a couple of boxes to do and it's really late. So it's going to be great next year for you.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. We're really looking forward to that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to our first listener question.
G'day, Brent. Mark from Staunton Vale. Mate, flow hives. What are some of the traps for people that are new to the beekeeping world, and what can they do to make sure their beekeeping is successful with the flow hive? Cheers, mate. Good luck.
Great question from Mark there. Thanks, Mark, for sending that in. Flow hive. I think everyone who's listening to this podcast will be aware of what a flow hive is. Great Australian invention.
Fantastic invention.
Yeah. What do you think about them?
I think there was a lot of skepticism at the beginning from particularly the old timers when they were about to hit the market and stuff. There was a lot of chatter. I said to myself, well, let's see. The proof is in the pudding. Let's see what actually happens. So I was able to actually set up several, probably at least a dozen beekeepers here in the Ballarat area with bees, and giving them tips how to successfully run a flow hive. So it's been an interesting journey. I've got a couple of myself. One I haven't really even commissioned. So I think they're a wonderful invention for those people that want to run a couple of hives in their backyard. And it's certainly to a large extent, and I won't say total extent, large extent, eliminates the extracting component. So purchasing extracting equipment, because you can certainly just crack the flow frame and off you go.
Absolutely. And they've been around now almost 10 years. And I've actually got a few friends that have got the ones that say 2005 crowdfunding on the side, which is really cool. Yeah, some of the early adopters. So they've been around almost 10 years and kind of proven themselves now. Do you think there's any things that people have to look out for, watch out for in terms of flow hive beekeeping?
In terms of traps for young players, is that what you're referring to? Or
like issues that you might have, that you have to watch out for? Things that, you don't necessarily see in the marketing.
Oh, absolutely. So the first thing that came through to me was the underplaying of the effort needed to run the hive. The impression was somewhat given that was going to be pretty easy and just turn on the tap and the honey will come out.
Mm-hmm. Which it does.
It does.
So
from that component,
it's actually amazing how well it works, in terms of honey extracting. I'm amazed by that.
That is, but that's the only difference. Mm-hmm. But that was the thing that was highlighted. And in my view, there wasn't enough highlighting of the fact of the knowledge needed to actually manage the hive. From my view, from what I saw of the ads, and that could have been sort of mentioned perhaps a little bit more. But hey.
But do you think that the knowledge required to run a flow hive is any more than regular kind of beekeeping with a Langstroth Super?
So let's take the flow box away from our discussion for this moment. Let's say we're running a single box. We've got bees. We're looking at their health, biosecurity, and everything else, their well-being. Well, the key thing is there is no difference between managing that hive and a normal commercial or backyard Langstroth hive, right? Because that is a Langstroth box that is used. The only thing and the first thing that I'll say, what Fly Hives does provide is flat pack frames with a tongue runner, for the bees to actually build the comb. Now, natural beekeeping, there's a lot of good things I like about it. But in terms of when people come to me and want to purchase bees and whatever else, I recommend they use wax foundation on wires, which will provide more stability, number one.
Yeah.
As they're learning, because as you know, when bees build a comb, you have to handle the frames very carefully in a particular way. So there is the risk of the comb falling out and smashing on the ground, including a queen. So that's something that I recommend. So when people purchase nucs from me, they'll get a frames with the wax foundation. I recommend not using those frames. Simply because I want the beekeeper to have a higher chance of success. And the other thing about it is that in the brood box, the bees, when they're a small colony, they're fine. They'll build that comb, but as they enlarge, and we'll get onto the drone question there.
Yeah.
You might end up, and they'll use larger drone cell sized for honey storage and for drone raising there, right? The reality is that the colony will enlarge and they won't be able to build more worker comb upstairs. They'll be limited to the worker comb that they actually raised in the bottom, right?
Yeah.
At that size of colony. So there already you have a limitation as to how big your colony might be, and it might be an oversupply of drones, for example, in production of drones, I should say. And I'm speaking, and I've got to premise that with the fact that I'm biased, and biased in the sense that I'm a commercial sideline beekeeper. That basically one of the key goals is to actually produce honey.
Yep.
So I'm all for drones. I like drones, but if there is an overabundance or an undersupply of worker bees in a brood box, that will cut into honey production. So if people want to, saying that again, if people just want to use those kind of frames there, that's fine, but be careful and be mindful. And if you've got an abundance of drones, that can also stimulate swarming. So there are other factors to come into play. But like we all know, where there are two beekeepers speaking, like we are here, there'll be three opinions or more.
So you think that if you consider that a flow hive is just like any other hive and you learn beekeeping just like you would if you were running a regular Langstroth hive, that there's no issues with the flow hive?
No, there's no issues with a fly hive in terms of its raising, as long as you manage it like you would manage normal hive. But then we are looking now into the... so we're talking just a brood box, but your question was in relation to the whole thing, right? Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a couple of differences because you've got a flow box, right? And that flow box, in my view, particularly in this area of Victoria, or let's say in Victoria, because the hive was developed, the technology was developed Byron Bay. Beautiful place, pretty warm all year round, etc. Less likely for the honey to candy there. Whereas people here in Victoria might have their fly hive close to a lot of ground flora forage, and ground flora forage tends to candy your clovers, your canolas and other things like that, or your cape weeds after a short period of time. So you'll need to manage you're extracting of your honey in a way that it doesn't crystallize your honey frames, because you don't want, you've got to be on top of it. As soon as the canola flowers are finishing off on the field, and if you're nearby, you've got to start extracting. Because what's going to happen, your flow frames won't be able to be opened, they'll just get blocked. And you're going to have to take them out, put them in hot water, or do whatever else needs to be done to actually decrystallize that honey. So that's certainly a key element, because that's your tool, that's your harvesting tool. And if you lose your 3 or 4 frames, what are you going to do? What are you going to fill that with? Langstroth frames don't fit in that easily in there. There are hybrids, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't personally own a flow hive, but I have had a lot of friends in the past, and I've got a lot of friends at the moment who've got them. But I haven't seen, what do you do when they candy?
Well, what do you do? What do you do with a normal frame is what I come back to. What do I do? Well, there's options. One, I can feed the bees with it. If you're desperate, you haven't got much honey, have had a poor season, you can just remove you possibly could remove the excluder, but I wouldn't in a sense, but that might prevent bees getting in there as efficiently, and leave it over for winter stores. I personally suggest to all my mentees to buy at least an ideal box and fill that with honey first, and that's your reserve. So in spring, if you fill that up with honey, and then you can pretty much put it on top of the flow box when you commission the flow box and do that. So that's very important, to actually have a surplus honey supply for winter, particularly here in Victoria.
Yeah.
And that's the mindset. I have ran high, and we can talk about ran hives, full high fly hives, but that's another thing.
Yeah. So let's say someone wants to overwinter their flow frames. I guess a really important thing there is to make sure the queen excluder is removed, so that they're not going to head up north and leave their queen behind, to get all that candied honey.
True, but then again, you don't want the queen laying in there. So
got to get it back on.
Yeah, exactly. So there are complexities there. So I would highly recommend to actually remove the flow box around April, let's say.
Yeah.
Around autumn, harvest it, let it sit there, open the cells up again. You crack them, and then you bring them back to the original state. Let the bees clean it up for 24 hours and take it off. In that manipulation after harvesting, you can just put that ideal on top of your flow box, and then your bees will have enough food for winter and be successful. I'm a strong believer in taking that off for winter, because you can have issues later.
Yeah, well, that's what I have seen a few times, is people leave the flow box on, and it might be to get out candied honey or something like that, but they do leave the queen excluder, and that's going to be an issue, because the queen is going to get separated. All the bees are going to head up and get all the honey, and she'll get left behind under the excluder. But then that is that problem. You don't want the queen laying up in the flow hive. So
that's right. The thing is, the queen, it's more efficient. I often don't think that she'll be left behind, because usually there's enough numbers. So what you're going to end up with a cluster in the honey box, and then you've got a cluster underneath, kind of with the queen. But it's all about efficiency, thermal efficiency of the actual colony, to start raising brood earlier. If she's separated, etc., that hive will be left behind. If you've got an idea without, for example, or just an idea which is a much smaller box, the queen and the bees can raise brood earlier. I often pull out the excluder altogether, even in an ideal, and the queen can start laying up, because she'll start laying up in the most thermally efficient place for the colony in August, for example, right? And then she'll gradually move down into the brood box and start laying there. So it's, for me, so this is a bit of sort of natural beekeeping thought. It's very important to do the best things for the bees, right? I might be into honey, but I'm also always thinking about my bees and what is best for the bees. And the best way to learn that is to ask the bees they'll tell you what's best for them.
A lot of times when people ask me, is a flow hive a good choice, I say the only downside is the expense. Would you agree with that?
The only downside is the expense. I would say that is certainly a downside. Let's be honest. They're very, very expensive for what they are. You need to, you need to prep the hive properly if you want it to last, like wax dip it. There's a few other tips that I've got down there, what we can do for a successful flow hive operation. The other thing is that at the end of the day, the box that they provide, the brood box and the flow box, generally isn't sufficient in terms of size for a colony. And what I have found is that often good, strong young queens require 3 deeps, equivalent of 3 deeps, right?
Okay, really?
Oh, absolutely. 3 deeps. If you've got a good, strong colony...
You mean 3 brood boxes?
No. Sorry. 3 deeps is a total, configuration of the hive. That's my terminology. There's different terminology. Let's say brood box and 2 supers, right?
Yep.
So you're going to collect honey in normal standard Langstroth wax frames as well, right? What I have done, for example, around Lake Wendouree, I ran a hive, 2 brood boxes and a flow box and a box of honey, okay? Which enabled the owner, because the queen was so good and laid up so well and did so well in 4 boxes. Successfully ran that, not a problem. So I'm not a proponent, well, let's say I'm not just one size fits all kind of beekeeper, or I will just run a single brood box with an excluder on it. No, I do have other hives that have produced a lot more for me. For example, this year I ran a few double brooders and I've produced 10 boxes of honey. 1 hive, right? So, saying no more.
Oh, well, thanks for that. All right, let's head on to the next question. So next question comes from
Could
Tom.
I maybe just give you, there's a couple of tips I wanted to give because that question wasn't fully exhausted.
Okay.
What I wanted to say, I have answered a lot of those. The other thing is that many beekeepers come to me for a hive and say, hey man, they're not getting into the flow box. Quick tip, wax every flow frame, and then before you put it on, spray it with sugar water. Quick tip, that's all it is. And then your bees are more likely to go in there and start working. Bees don't take naturally to plastic, and that's why you need to coat it. The other thing I would recommend is make sure that you prepare but when you put them together, do it properly. Screw it properly, and I would suggest either linseed oil or wax dipping and then painting your woodware. It'll last you a lot longer. Just to give the listeners an example, a box painted with an outdoor paint, a pine box, versus a box that was wax dipped and then painted, there's a difference of longevity between 5 and 50 years. So it can be up to 10 times difference in terms of how long it'll come.
Yeah, and on wax dipping, for those people who don't have a wax dipper, which is most people, your local bee farmer will probably be able to do it for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've just actually,
Yeah.
My friend and I just, we welded a double.
Yeah.
I'll show you, Brent.
Yeah, excellent.
A double wax dipper, etc. But it's very important, and that's pretty much. And the only other thing I'd say for bee fly hives, like for everybody else, there's a regular time commitment and to manage your bees and your bee health. A couple of hours a fortnight. But anyway, I'll leave it there. But I thought I'd just throw those couple of things in that are important. And there are many other tips that you can probably find on the Flow Hive page.
Well, thanks for that. All
No worries.
Next question comes from Tom, and he's got a question about drones.
Hey guys, congrats on the new podcast. I have a beekeeping question, or bees in general question. I'm really curious about drone bees and their role within a healthy colony. What numbers or percentage of drone bees should you be seeing in spring and summer? What's too much of a percentage of drone bees? And what's a great way to ensure your bees have got good numbers and good hive genetics throughout the area as well? Thanks.
Good question there from Tom. Drones.
What a wonderful question. It's an area, Brent, I think that many people don't really focus on, do they?
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
function of drones. We all know that they provide the sperm and the genetic diversity for the hive and all the hives in the area, and they are very, very important. One thing I'll say that in the Polish language, drone is truteń. Sort of implies somebody that is lazy and doesn't do much.
That's pretty.
A loafer, a free loafer.
It's a good translation, I think.
Yeah, a loafer. So
yeah, they just hang out, don't they?
They just hang out.
Yeah,
they
get fed.
They do have benefits. I have seen drones feeding themselves.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Taking things up. I have, and the other thing is drones provide, that critical mass as well in terms of heating and whatever else. They generally, I find them sitting on the outside frames when they're in the brood box, but they provide a really important function for the hive. The question was, in summer, what's a good number of drones? Well, we'll probably have to start with the size of your colony. All right, size of your colony and what forage is available. So small colonies, nucleus colonies that are developing, that might be 6-7 frames, their focus is on expansion rather than on drone raising. So they don't do that. An established colony of a couple of boxes, let's say for example, will raise at least half a frame of drones, at least. And that's good, half a frame, even up to a frame of drones. So having a half a frame of drones being raised at certain periods of time is very healthy, and it really doesn't detract from, for example, if somebody was focused on honey raising. I love to see drones in my brood box, and you can actually rip off, for example, what you could do is rip off a little strip at the bottom of your new foundation frame, and the bees will build drone comb at the bottom, and you'll have some drones. Now, I believe that drones, diverting here, will be very important in terms of when we're coming to manage varroa.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one management tool that we will need to utilise, which is drones, but numbers of drones.
Mm-hmm. And just for listeners here, both Pete and I are currently varroa free. We think.
Yes.
We think.
Yeah, we believe so.
But they're knocking on the door. We're going to get them any day. So that's what we have to learn. Varroa management, and as you said, drones are a good way of dealing with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I did allude to previously is that free comb in your brood box. If you're running totally free comb, you're going to have a lot more drones. And when you have a lot more drones, there is a greater propensity for swarming. So I tried at a certain level to have a limitation on my drones. So I'll allow the bees to raise drones as much as they like in my brood box, but I'll only have worker comb. But in certain situations, I might sometimes actually use half a frame of foundation, and I'll let the bees do, say, the other half, for example, diagonally, and I'll let them raise drones and put honey in that. I'm very comfortable with that. It's not an issue to me. So it's a very difficult question. How do you want to quantify names, numbers? What I did say was half a frame of raising drones in your brood box. Hey, that's cool. That's cool. And they'll often do it on the bottom bars, below the bottom bars, if you've got a deep bottom board. I don't know. What do you think, Brent?
For people like me who are raising queens, it's incredibly important to have high levels of drones. And you can do that by putting in drone frames and making sure that the colonies are fed quite a bit. And it's very important for raising queens. So for me personally, I really need to have a lot of drones. But for the average beekeeper or hobbyist beekeeper, it's something that is a natural thing that the bees are going to be doing, and it's healthy for the hive. But I don't think you should be too worried either way. You're going to open up that hive in spring. You're going to see heaps of drones. They're going to taper off as it goes through summer, and I don't think you need to be too worried either way, if you think there's too many or too little, it's not a huge deal. I don't think you need to try and manipulate the hive to try and reduce them or to try and increase them if you're not raising queens. I will say though, one thing that's been really nice since I started raising queens and using drone frames is it keeps all my other frames pretty tidy.
Ah, nice.
Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever done that?
Well, no, I haven't, because I only use cell builders to raise my, as we've raised them together, queens.
But if you put in drone frames, they stop trying to put drones everywhere else in the box, which is something that I didn't realize they would do before I started. And I thought, all my other frames are really uniform and nice, and there's worker brood and there's no drone brood in them.
So what does that tell you? You know.
Well, I mean, I'm putting in a whole frame. I'm using one of those green drone frames, and that's more than enough space for one hive to lay drones in. And they left the other frames alone. So
but it also tells me that the bees are managing the drone numbers. They haven't got a need to be pumping drones in your other frames or modifying, playing around with the wax frames. They go, hey, we've got space here to raise our boys, and we'll keep the rest for worker brood, which is really good. So the short answer really is don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Let the bees worry about the drone numbers, because they'll go up and down depending on the flow. If there is very little flow in the middle of summer, they won't raise any drones. They'll just basically stop. That's the first thing that they stop doing, because they want to manage their resource, and they go, okay, hey, not much coming. Sorry?
How'd you get?
Well, even out you get, but the converse of that is, my bees this year, the ones that I've had on Desert Banks, it was a beautiful flow that has finished now. They were raising drones in May. You're talking middle of autumn in the desert, middle desert. They were raising, I had open brood drones, boom, big patches.
Which for us in a cold part of Australia, that's pretty amazing.
That is pretty amazing for them to do that. Now, they wouldn't do that there normally if there wasn't a flow. So what's the trigger? It's actually really good conditions. So not only was there honey coming in, but the Desert Banksia pollen is very high protein, right? And they'd say, hey, we've got plenty of resources here. I had to rip out frames of honey out of nucs every 2 weeks, believe it or not. So that to me was like, wow, conditions are pretty much everything.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, all right. Well, let's have a look at the next question. Next question is from Luke.
G'day, Brent. I've got a few hives, but how do I know when it's a good time to requeen them? And will they just requeen themselves, or should I do it for them? Thanks.
Great question from Luke there. Thank you. About requeening.
Very good question, and I think there's probably slightly different approaches and protocols. When you compare a commercial beekeeper, somebody that's really serious, versus a backyarder. And I've been at every part of that spectrum. So as a backyarder, I sometimes like my queens, and if I could keep them going, they were still laying well, I had a few 3-year-old queens, right? I'm happy with this queen. Why should I requeen her? Okay, so that, I guess, answers the question. You generally requeen because there's a need to requeen, okay? And then one of the first clues is your queen was poorly mated. She's starting shooting blanks. By blanks, I mean there's a lot more drones being produced in worker comb. And if you don't address that issue...
And that goes back to our drone question. So if we probably should have mentioned it at the time, if you open up your hive and you see that there's a huge amount of drones and they're everywhere, drone brood, then that is probably a sign that, the queen does need to be changed, because she's now become a drone layer, and that's too many drones. You don't need that many. So, yeah.
Well, but you will, in that transition stage, you will have patches of brood, worker brood, but then you'll have a lot of drone brood.
Yeah.
And what I didn't have time to do to one of my hives, which was a lesson to me this year, was I saw that in one of the hives, and I knew in my head, mark it, this needs requeening, right? And I put a mark on that thing, but I never got around to it. The next time I went to that hive, the hive was totally drone full.
Yep.
And queenless, whatever. So what I did with that hive, simply merged it with another strong hive, so those resources were being utilised. But you got to get on that. So it's very important to have a look how your queen is laying, particularly a good time to address that, I believe, is sort of late summer, early autumn. Because then, and if you're on some sort of a flow, you'll get a really good indication how well your queen is performing right at that time. In spring, it's a little bit harder to pick up, but in autumn, you'll know. It's a good time to actually requeen in autumn, because then they're very less likely to swarm in spring, providing you give them enough room, because it's a very young queen. So I raised a lot of queens from one of my AI queens, as we both did, and I have found that those bees in autumn, it took a while to mate, but they're just beautiful, laying very strongly and beautifully. And the other advantage of requeening in autumn is, or late summer, is that you get good numbers of bees for winter as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So part of that question was, will they requeen themselves? What do you think about that?
As in the case in point?
Well, in that particular case, they won't. If they've become a drone layer, they're not going to.
Yeah, but the colony generally, what I have found, if they have a failing queen or something like, they'll draw a couple of supersedure cells, right? And they'll go, hey, we have a problem here. Let's fix it by raising a couple of cells, right? Or an older queen. And I've seen that in autumn. I've had an instance where I've got mum and 2 daughters in autumn, right? So they will do that, but it's not a guarantee. So you will have failing hives. I don't know what the percentages would be, but probably a lower percentage, 20, 30% won't requeen. They'll just fail, unfortunately, and the hive is doomed. And so you've got to get onto that very quickly.
A lot of times they will requeen themselves, but
not always. Yeah.
Not always. And if you're looking for more honey production or maybe a gentler queen, it is good to buy a queen and requeen it. And there's, a whole process behind requeening and the best way to do it. But, good question there by Luke.
Yeah, very good. The other thing that I had in mind here is really a poor pattern. So a shotgun pattern will give you an idea, perhaps to look at disease issues, but often it is just a poor, the queen is pretty poor. You might have chalk brood or whatever else. So, the pattern in autumn, particularly for me, is a really good clue. Am I actually going to take this queen through winter or not? And that's a really good question to ask at the end of summer. Do your brood inspections. Biosecurity regulation require you to do at least a minimum of 2, spring and autumn. Lately, go through all your hives and have a look where they're at, because you don't want to be taking a failing hive or failing queen into winter. You really want a strong and vigorous one. And, commercial guys generally won't run a queen for more than 2 years.
And
requeen it.
Yeah, and the reason why you would requeen before 2 years or at the 2-year mark is, just like Pete said, you're taking less chances the following year. Just getting ahead of those issues. And I do let some of my queens run past that.
We have all done that.
Well, no, I do it intentionally, because I have some queens, breeder queens, that are just fantastic and I just can't let them go. But generally speaking, at 2-year mark, they're all getting requeened. Sometimes I'll requeen every year if I have enough. And, it's just reducing those potential issues that are going to crop up the next year.
I fully agree with that, and I think prevention is the best medicine, I believe. And so if you're seeing some issues, or you're not sure as a backyard beekeeper, I'm not quite sure, this isn't looking quite right, whether it's in relation to queens or disease, please act. Because the earlier you act, the less pain down the road.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks for that, Pete. Is there anything else you want to have a quick chat about before we wrap up the podcast today?
Oh, maybe, you know what? Since we're talking about queens, Brent, let's talk about your and my queen introduction methods.
Yeah.
Because that's all. Since we're talking about requeening, what are some of the good, successful queen introduction methods
that I use personally,
or
that I would recommend to other people?
Both.
Okay. So I have some really good equipment that I use to introduce very good queens, breeder queens that I get from friends, or a queen that I definitely don't want to be, kicked out, I actually have a couple of cages that you put the whole frame in. And so it's a queen isolation cage. She can't get out of it. You can put a queen in, and it's got sort of a mesh, and you put a queen in there with brood, and no other bees can get in there, but all the brood hatches out. That's a really effective one. So that's called a queen introduction cage. So they're really, really good, but they're hard to get in Australia, and they're a bit expensive. What I would recommend for people to use is a pushing cage. So I make pushing cages, and I actually sell them to people when people buy queens from me if they want to buy one. And basically, I use gutter mesh. So gutter mesh that I just get it from the local hardware store, and you make it up. It's about the size of a CD, and it gets pushed into the brood. So what you do is you take the queen, you take her out of her transport cage, ditch the attendants, and just put her straight on top of the brood. Shake all the bees off, put her straight on top of the brood, put that cage on top, and then the bees that emerge out of there, they think that she's their mum. They don't know any different. And then you can leave that in there for sort of 3 or 4 days, take it off, see how the other bees are going. If they're calm around her, then you're good. But if they're sort of a little bit edgy around her, you can do it again. Move her somewhere else, put the cage back down, and generally after the second time, it's really, really good. So that is the best method that I've seen. But people usually have a pretty good experience just with putting the queen cage into the hive and using the time delay of the queen candy. And that works pretty well. Most people would do that.
Yeah, it's good. And with that method, Brenton, there has been, and I've experimented with a few things. There are some people that basically remove the queen, but leave the hive queenless for 24 or 48 hours. Or, as most commercials will do, just do a straight ahead manipulation by destroying the queen, and some by rubbing the old queen pheromones on the new cage, and actually placing that with the opening up around where the young open wet brood is, so the queen gets fed fairly well at that time. Now, when I speak to my commercial mates who've done many an introduction, they go, you know what, it doesn't matter. Sometimes they get accepted, sometimes they don't. Sometimes I should really say, get a higher acceptance, and sometimes they get a lower acceptance. But what I have actually found, that doing it during a honey flow is probably the best thing. I have found on canola, I get certainly some rejections. Bees get a little bit narky, etc. But on things like yellow box, red gum, all those kind of things, I've had some very, very aggressive hives, aggressive, defensive, what do you want to call them, that are basically dispatched the genetics and placed a new one, and the queen was accepted very readily. Came back in, and the demeanour of the hive has totally changed. So that's another good reason to requeen. So that's what I use. I have used virgins as well. I had one instance I had where I basically had this virgin that basically hatched out of a cell, and I'm like, oh, and she's sort of like half alive, and I'm like, I've got nothing to lose here. I'll put in this aggressive hive right away from the brood, and she was like almost half stuck in the cage. So I left it then and forgot about it, but I did mark the lid. And I came back to this hive, and I thought, this hive's supposed to be jumping at me, but it's not. And then I found the cage where that queen was in, and I go, so this virgin got well, became an assassin, dispatched the mated queen that was very defensive, and took over the running of the hive. So we can talk about that at some stage, requeening with protected cells. They do a lot of that in New Zealand, actually. But it's something that I've tried this year, and I've had some success with that. And I'll continue to experiment, because certainly it's a time saver.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks for that, Pete. Now, for those people who haven't seen Pete's Facebook page, it's The Polish Beekeeper, and I would recommend that you follow it, because it's probably one of the most amazing Facebook pages for photos. So Pete is always putting up these really, really incredible photos about his beekeeping. And, recently he's been up in the desert and you get the sunrise photos and, you get all the multicolored hives and everything. And it's impossible to not look at these photos and not want to become a beekeeper. So thanks for doing that, Pete. And thanks for being here today. Well, thanks for letting me come to your place today.
No, absolute pleasure to host you, Brent. It's lovely. And feel free to send me any questions on my Polish Beekeeper page or Messenger or via Instagram at the Polish Beekeeper. So
and you'll be selling nucs?
Yeah, definitely selling nucs in spring.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be raising queens for as we all do, and looking forward to a really good season. And I just want to wish all those listeners there all the best. Have courage. Give things a go. Give things a crack. And experiment. And this has been one of my mantras in beekeeping. You're unsure, do ask. But do experiment, don't be afraid, and mind you, the bees will work around your mistakes more often than not.
Good advice. Yeah, be nice to yourself. We all make mistakes. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Pete.
Good on you. Thanks.